And my name is Esther. I'm one of the leaders here at Abbey Church. It's good to see you all this morning. So on a Sunday morning at the moment, we are in a teaching series called The Church at Colossae Part 1, which, as you may have guessed, points to the Church at Colossae Part 2. That is happening in July and August, so look forward to that. And in these two series together, we're taking an intentionally slow walk through the Bible book of Colossians. And this book is actually a letter. It's written by a guy called Paul while he was in prison to a group of new Jesus followers in a town called Colossae. And just a quick side note, if you're not familiar with Paul in the Bible, he has an awesome story that is well worth checking out in the Bible book of Acts. Some transformation, to say the least, so do have a look at that. But back to Colossae, and let's start with a bit of background. So what was actually going on in this place? What was it like to be living there? What real life situations was Paul speaking into when he wrote this letter? And so it was a dangerous time to be choosing to follow Jesus. Anyone or anything that claimed to be Lord was in direct opposition to Caesar, which was a position you didn't really want to be in. And like other towns and cities nearby, Colossae had a whole range of different gods for public worship for different occasions. And there was an understanding across the board that this was an order, a way of life not to be messed with. So these Jesus followers in Colossae were contending with the philosophy and the politics of their culture. And at the same time, there were the very loud voices of the Jewish leaders demanding that they now also follow all 613, yes, 613 Jewish laws, like no compromise, no exceptions. So the message that they were hearing from all sides was, this Jesus you're following, he's not enough. You need more. You need to do more. And it's into this context that Paul gets writing. And his letter as a whole aims to encourage and strengthen this group of people with a new and vulnerable faith. Like to cut through that noise, to cut through the competing voices, to hold up Jesus as being enough. And so over the last 2 weeks, we have covered the first 14 verses of Colossians. And Paul's letter, it starts with his own thankfulness for the faith and love growing in this new church in Colossae. And this is followed by prayers of encouragement, reminding of the potential that they all have because of God's love and God's Spirit in them. And last Sunday, Sarah talked about, when she was talking about potential, a picture that I really liked, about tiny green shoots growing into great big trees. I really like that. So today, we're going to have a look at Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 18. And our title for today is The Supremacy of Jesus. And as we get into these verses, I think it's important to say out loud that supremacy is a word that can have seriously negative connotations in our world today. So putting it alongside Jesus might kind of seem a little bit off. And like as an example, Wikipedia defines white supremacy as the belief that white people are superior to those of other races and thus should dominate them. It is an ideology that has justified and approved unspeakable violence and oppression. It's been used in horrendous abuses of power and is unfortunately not confined to stories from our past. Like this definition of supremacy is so far away from and in complete opposition to Jesus. Like today, when we talk about the supremacy of Jesus, it is not about superiority and domination. This is not Jesus. And so, as we read, let's keep in mind the context Paul was speaking into, and it'll help us hear the importance or the urgency even in his message to the people of Colossae. Paul's saying Jesus is the center of it all. Jesus is enough. So let's have a read. Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 18. If you've got a Bible on your phone or however you prefer to do that, follow along. Also on the wall behind me. So Colossians 1, 15 to 18. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. So in this part of the letter, Paul switches it up a little bit, and he hits the Colossians with some poetry. And as someone who loved studying English literature and language, that is me, at uni I wrote an essay on comparing 16th century female poets and the Spice Girls. If you want to have a read, speak to me later. But anyway, the hint of poetry, it gets me a little bit excited. And I know you're not all with me on that, but bear with me. So if you have verses 15 and 16 together, and 17 and 18 together, they're two separate parts, otherwise known as a stanza, store that run parallel alongside each other. So they express very similar concepts in slightly different contexts. And I wonder if Paul uses this change in style within his letter to help make something that he sees as being really important easier to remember. Because, it's not like they could photocopy this letter and get it spread far and wide quickly. And in these verses, Paul also uses language and imagery that points back to the Old Testament, to the creation story in Genesis 1, and to lots of the Psalms. Like, if you have a look at Psalm 8 as an example, there's loads of good stuff in there about creation and how we all fit together that's very similar to what we've just read. And so maybe Paul uses pictures that these people are familiar with to communicate a new, world-shaking concept, and by that I mean Jesus, in an accessible kind of way. Whatever the reasons, Paul's Jesus poem, it feels to me like a chunky gold nugget. Like it's something precious, something weighty that Paul is giving to them and asking them and us hold on tightly to. Or maybe it's more like a stick of dynamite. Words containing truth so powerful that it could blow everything we all thought we knew apart. So we're going to break these verses down into 4 bits this morning. We are going to look at an invisible God, the beginning, all, and the church for Jesus. So this first one, an invisible God, ? Is definitely a stick of dynamite. Because the answer to this question is no. God is not invisible, not now. And to us, I don't know, I wonder if this might seem a bit obvious. Like, we know Jesus shows us what God is like. We can say, Jesus is God with skin on, really quite casually, without giving it much of a second thought. Sometimes I think it's really easy for us to take Jesus for granted. Like, can you imagine if we had the God stuff without Jesus? Like, if we had the Old Testament part of our Bible, and that's where it ends. Like, so we would believe in God, we would know that God is a part of this world and our lives, but we wouldn't have the person of Jesus to see God through. Like, I don't know if you see what I mean. Like, for me, that would be really, really tricky. And so for Paul, if you're going to put a poem in the middle of a letter you're writing, Paul's first line, our verse 15, is the ultimate mic drop, a huge stick of dynamite. He says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation." Or as it says in the Living Bible translation, Christ is the exact likeness of the unseen God. For these early Christians, this is still an interesting concept to wrap their heads around. Like, God is Jesus, Jesus is God. God is no longer invisible, some kind of not quite tangible thing up there, because you just need to look at Jesus. Like Jesus, the person who lived life on the same planet you're living on, breathed the same air you're breathing, in a very similar human body. Like, just have a look at what Jesus did. Listen to what he said. This is God. Like, this is mind-blowing. And then Paul's like, because he just keeps going, doesn't he? He's like, don't get too comfortable, because you know this Jesus, the person you've heard stories about, the person you know people have actually seen with their own eyes, the one who points us to God. Well, this Jesus was actually there at the beginning. You know, like the very beginning. And so if we read verse 16 again, it says, "For in him," and this is Jesus, "all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him." I think this is another stick of dynamite. And I'm going to ask you to use your imaginations for a minute. Some of you go into a mild panic. Imagine you're stood out at the front of this building, or wherever you are right now. Like, look up and down the street. Everything you see is created in, through, and for Jesus. Imagine your friends, your family, your work colleagues, your neighbours, all created in, through, and for Jesus. Imagine a tree, the sea, cheese, a dog, inventions, science, the stars in the sky, planet Earth, and the vastness we're all a part of. Every single thing created in, through, and for Jesus. And finally, imagine looking in a mirror. Like that person you see looking back at you. Created in, through, and for Jesus. In these verses, Paul doesn't box Jesus into 3 years' worth of stories we read in the New Testament part of our Bible, to a few well-known miracles. Jesus isn't even confined to his amazing birth story, his horrendously awesome sacrificial death and life-changing resurrection story. Jesus is bigger, more even than that. Jesus is in everything, and Jesus created everything. And this isn't Paul, getting all giddy and excited, because we can read this in other parts of the Bible. In the first chapter of John, in verses 2 and 3, it says, "He," that's Jesus, "was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." And even right back in Genesis, in the creation story, we read, "Let us make human beings in our image." Jesus is there, right from the start. And you might be thinking, well, it's quite interesting, vaguely, Esther, but so what? Well, for me, the so what is a 3-letter word that's repeated throughout our verses. And it's a word that I think ties everything we've looked at so far together. And I think it's a game changer for us and how we do life as a follower of Jesus. And that word is all. And this is actually one of my favourite words in the Bible. It can be easy to miss, but it's in there a lot. And it's one of my favourite words because it reminds me all reminds me that God's love is radically inclusive and expansive, and it's a love that cannot be contained. And in our verses today, the word all is in there 5 times. 2 of those in verse 17 alone. And verse 17 says, "He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So in Jesus, all things hold together. And earlier this week, when I was preparing this, I sat for ages thinking about this. In Jesus, all things hold together. And it felt like one of those things that seemed kind of pretty simple on the face of it. But when you start to focus in on it, it seems like it becomes something so huge and hard to pin down that it gives you a headache. Well, it gave me a headache anyway. Like in Jesus, all things hold together. And I think part of the headache is we, so me and you, we are one tiny part of the all things of verse 17. And I don't mean that we're small and insignificant. I mean this in the most awesome and liberating kind of way. Because we are one tiny part of the all things. Because this life, it's not all on me. It's not all on you. It's Jesus. Like Jesus is here running through all the stuff of life, in amongst everything, holding all things together in his giant hands. And this is very cool, isn't it? Like Jesus holding all things together. But at the same time, it also makes me feel a bit sad because as humanity, we are so fractured and divided, so individualistic and me-centered. And this feels the exact opposite of the Jesus way that Paul is describing. And in her book, Tarry a While, Selena Stone picks up on this as she talks about these verses from Colossians. And have a read of this. She says, "To speak of oneness is not to speak of sameness, but of the fundamental interdependence and interconnectedness of all creation, which finds its source in God. This is a joyous truth, that my life is bound together with yours." And she goes on to say, "Our frustration at this gap between the truth and reality is an indication, I think, that we know deep down things should not be this way. The longing we have for right relationships between all people, dignity for all and justice for the oppressed is born from this knowledge, which we cannot always articulate. But this is a joyous truth, that my life is bound together with yours." And that tension is really real, isn't it? Like we know the Jesus way, that all things being held together, the oneness that Selena Stone talks about, like that's there. But then the reality of what we see in the world around us, in church, in our communities, it points to something else. So it's a real tension that I think we need to wrestle with. And where do we go with this? Like, what do we do? And I think we probably need to have a look at ourselves. And in that, we will move on to point 4, which is the church for Jesus. So just remember, Paul is writing to these Jesus followers in Colossae at a time when they were being bombarded by different voices telling them they needed more gods, more rules. Jesus alone wasn't enough. And let's have a read of verse 18. It says, "And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy." As a gathering of people, a new church, Paul keeps pointing them to Jesus, urging them to remember Jesus is your beginning, Jesus is your middle, Jesus is your end, and don't forget, church, Jesus is your head. And this image might be a familiar one, like the church as a body made up of all different parts. And yes, of course, Jesus is the boss, the head, the focus, the source, underlying everything. We all know that, don't we? Yet, we often make church all about me. My kind of people. My needs to be met my kind of way. And we get impressed with ourselves. We get busy. We create a brand, a clique, and we just about squeeze Jesus in. But as church, as this church together, we need Jesus. Without him, we're nothing. There's no point. With Jesus, if Jesus is our head, all things are possible. Every church is salt and light, living water in our communities, all possible. Every church is a place where people are fed, that is a place of healing, all possible. Every church is a place and a people where all the awesomeness of Jesus resides. All possible. But only with Jesus. Only with Jesus as our head. And that's exciting, right? Yeah? Yeah, I think so. And here's the thing. There's always a thing, isn't there? Have a check back to the end of verse 16. It says, we've been created and put together through Jesus and for Jesus. Not for ourselves, not even for each other, for Jesus. And this throws up a load of questions for me. And one of those questions is, and that I've asked myself, what might we need to let go of so we can begin to live all out for Jesus? And I asked myself that question, what is getting in the way of that? And for me, letting go of my quiet but very present ego and pride, closely followed by my strong desire to be in control, those things would be a start. But what might it mean for you personally, for us as a church, to live in that truth of being created for Jesus? What might Jesus invite us to let go of? And weirdly, maybe, I'm a bit excited about this, because Jesus is the boss of my life and this church. And so this might come back to bite me, but I'm going to say it out loud. Anything that is opposed to or gets in the way of that, of Jesus being the boss of my life, the boss of this church, let's get it gone. Because this is for Jesus. This is why we do this stuff. We're created through him and for him, every single one of us here. And that's an absolute game changer when we grab hold of that. So I've got just a couple of suggestions of how we might respond in this. And I'm 99% sure that both of these words are very specifically for me personally, but I'm inviting you to join in with me. There are, a couple of words that have kind of feel like God's probably pointing our way. The first one is surrender. I don't know how you're feeling right now with all that I've said, and maybe your head is full, maybe it's absolutely empty, whatever. But when Jesus prays to God just before he's about to be crucified, knowing what is ahead, he prays a prayer that we're probably quite familiar with. Your way, not mine. And Like, this is a big prayer. But I think, like, for me personally, it's something I pray quite regularly, particularly when my head is kind of full, which is a lot of the time. And I'm just like, Jesus, here I am. Whatever is going on right now in front of me, your way, not mine. Simple, but huge. So, yeah, like maybe surrender is something. Another thing, pruning. If you have a read of John 15, and in it, Jesus uses a gardening analogy. And he talks about God being a gardener who cuts off the rubbish and dead bits in order for new life to grow. And maybe that's something that God is pointing us to. And maybe it comes back to that. What is Jesus inviting us to let go of so we can live life to the full with him and for him? So, yeah, a couple of words to throw out there for you to have a think on. Maybe God is saying something totally different to you, which is great. But yeah, just encourage you as I pray now. Ask God, what are you saying? What's going on for you individually, maybe for us as church. If you want someone to pray with you, we would love to do that. Be sat at the front here. And if you feel like God's saying something and that maybe it's to share with us as church, then have a chat with Rach and we'll listen to that and see what God might be saying. I'm going to pray. Jesus, we need you. Thank you for, this feels like, to me anyway, a mind-blowing picture of who you are in these few verses that we've read this morning, that, you are everything. You are enough. You're, running through all the stuff of our lives. Jesus, will you show us how, to live in you, through you, for you? Will you, help us to come to you humbly as we are, with all of the things in our lives. And in this moment right now, I want to pray your prayer, Jesus. Your way, not ours. Will you help us to put aside the stuff that gets in the way of you? The stuff that, we as church need to let go of that, stops people seeing you, Jesus. Will you do your gardening thing in us? Will you, remove the rubbish, remove the dead stuff. And in that, as you do that, we trust that you do that to bring new life. So Jesus, as we respond and as we worship you, we give ourselves to you. Will you be the head of everything that we are, everything that we do? Pray that it will be for you, Jesus, in your glory. Amen.